Hello, everyone. Last living room of 2022. Thanks for being here. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. Everyone else, welcome back. Say hello. Let us know where you're coming from in the chat. I'm Ana Brozepite. I'm the Education Director at Christina T. Miller Sustainable Jewelry Consulting, where we provide strategy, guidance, and education on responsible sourcing and sustainability for the jewelry industry. I'm here today, as usual, with Christina Miller and Cecilia Echeverri, our Director of Operations and Outreach. If you'd like to find out more about us and our services, you can check out our website. We'll drop the link in the chat. It's christinatmiller.com. So this is the living room. It's an informal virtual hangout to support community and connection on issues related to responsible sourcing in jewelry. We cover different topics every month, and we love to hear from all of you, so you can feel free to share feedback, anything you'd like to hear about in the future, any ideas you have for us, by filling out this form on our website. We'll also drop that in the chat. I want to say thank you to everyone who showed up to have this conversation today. And thank you to those that have been able to contribute with the pay what you want option. We're so happy to be able to provide these sessions for you. So thank you for helping us make that possible. For a little bit of housekeeping, we are recording this session. These videos will be in the public realm. So you're welcome to speak up and put your questions in the chat. But when you're not speaking, please stay muted for better sound quality and to provide the floor for our guests who will be presenting. If you're private messaging, keep it kind. The private chat should be respectful of participants' privacy and personal space. Remember to subscribe to our email list to stay up to date. We'll drop that link in the chat as well. And our next living room session will be next year, January 20th, 2023. Now I'll hand it over to Christina to introduce our guests for today.
All right, welcome everybody. We are super excited to have Tiffany Stevens and Sara Yood, both of the Jewelers Vigilance Committee. Tiffany is President and CEO and General Counsel of the Jewelers Vigilance Committee and currently serves on the boards of USKPA, which you'll have to tell us what that stands for, USJC, and CIBJO, CIBJO is an interesting one. It's an organization that is more available outside of the United States, but definitely is an organization that we should all be familiar with. And then Sara Yood is Deputy General Counsel at the Jewelers Vigilance Committee. She's an attorney admitted to the state of New York with extensive experience in intellectual property law. So the two of them have prepared a presentation for all of you today that we're looking forward to. We can post questions to both of them in the chat as the conversation evolves with what they're sharing with us. And we're going to have time for Q&A in the latter half of the program. So we hope you brought with you your questions. We hope you brought your notebooks with you today, because this is one of those sessions where the information will be valuable to you on a very practical basis. For those of you that are joining from outside the United States, we are taking note of that, and there are some things that are relevant depending on your business relationships or the way you practice your jewelry in your roles outside of the United States. So I've been looking forward to this one for a while, and really enjoy working with Tiffany and Sara. Our work dovetails really nicely as two organizations, and so we're glad to be able to support what they're doing and also support you in your efforts to be the most responsible jewelry businesses that you can be. All right. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Christina. Sara and I are really happy to be here with you and to be here with the living room community. I see on the people who've joined some really good old friends and some names I don't recognize. So really happy to be with everyone. And Sara and I have prepared for you guys like a very dense presentation. We're really hitting like all the marks on this one. So feel free to interrupt with questions or anything like that. But we really are going to try to just like get you through all of the topics that you need to know about and the things that we focus on at the JVC. So very excited to be with you. And Christina, USKPA is the Kimberley process. So each country has their own sub-organization that like does all the licenses and reports in. And so that's for better or for worse, I'm involved in the US part of that process. Okay, so we can just jump on in. So several of you on the call are JVC members. So just like up top, thank you so much for your membership, because we are a membership driven organization. So the only reason we can do our work is if you actually join and become a member. So thank you to those of you who are members. And if you're curious about being a member, you can join at jvclegal.org/membership. And we'd love to have you. And like Christina said, the way that we've curated this presentation for you today, it really is based for, but it's based for doing business in the US. So even if you're based somewhere else, I think you'll find a lot of the things relevant, because if you're trying to sell to anyone in the US market, pretty much all of these things are going to apply to you. And if you have country specific, thank you, Monica. If you have country specific questions, we can get into those at the end. But JVC, we do a million things. I can't tell you everything right now, but just sort of in a nutshell, we were organized in 1917 for Jewelers by Jewelers here in New York City, where Sara and I both live and where our office is based. And we've covered many different ethical and compliance topics over the 105 years we've been in existence. We find that our sort of core issues that we work on now are anti-money laundering, which Sara is going to give us a really beautiful summation of everything you need to know there, which is ever evolving, as well as sort of the big umbrella that I'll call advertising. And there's a lot of different things that fall into that, from specific jewelry advertising to influencer marketing to made in the USA stuff to green claims, which I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about today. And we do a million other things as well to look out for the industry. But the way we do our work, half of our time we work with mostly the federal government in the US. We face them, we advocate on behalf of the jewelry industry and our specific needs at the agency level. We also are present in many international forums representing the US market. Christina mentioned CIBJO, that's one of a few that we're involved in. And then the other half of our time, we spend working one-on-one with our members on their concerns and questions, helping educate on all of our issues, and then presenting in forums like today, and just making sure everyone has all of the information that we need. And these things are not two separate things. They're very much working in harmony with each other, because we get to understand your concerns at the business level, you know, at the counter, at the bench. What are you dealing with? What's bothering you? Where are you hung up? What's the problem? You know, that helps us and educates us, so we can then take those concerns to the government and create sort of this like life cycle that hopefully keeps our industry healthy and flowing really well. So that's a little bit about what we do. And like I said, these are the sort of main topics we're going to hit today. What you've got to do around due diligence and anti-money laundering. We're going to touch on sustainability and green guides, which sort of falls under that advertising umbrella because it's such an important topic now. And then some nomenclature stuff we thought you guys might be interested in, and then transparency, and then we'll wrap up and have time for questions about anything you want to get into. And with that, I will turn it over to Sara.
Thanks, Steph, and hi, everyone. It is lovely to see so many friends and new faces here today. So I'm going to start off by talking about due diligence and anti-money laundering compliance. You may know this with like using other terminology. You probably have encountered this even if you aren't exactly sure what AML is. You've heard the term AML, or you've heard KYC. and thought, I don't know what that stands for, but I know I fill out some forms for my suppliers or my customers. That is actually, it's sort of all encompassing in what we're talking about. So the rules for anti-money laundering compliance come from two different sources in the United States. The first is actually the Bank Secrecy Act, which was a law passed by Congress in 1970. And in that law, Congress essentially told the Treasury Department, one of those federal agencies that we work with, hey, we think that there's a bunch of businesses that are at risk for being used for money laundering or terrorist financing, and you need to go regulate them. And the Treasury Department said, cool, thanks for sending us this really, really long list. We're going to do the first 5 and then ignore you. And that is what happened between 1970 and 2001. The Treasury Department only regulated the first 5, which included like banks and other, really high-end, like high-level financial institutions. And they never got all the way down to the rest of the list where precious metals and precious gems were. And then after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which has a lot of stuff in it. As I think we all know, lots of, investigatory and surveillance capabilities, but also in the Patriot Act, Congress said, hey, Treasury Department, remember in 1970 when we told you all that you had to do this and you didn't do it? Now you really, really, really have to do it. So the Treasury Department then went and did this whole, investigative process and looked at all of the different areas where they were supposed to have regulated. And with the help of the JVC, actually, drafted the regulations for anti-money laundering here in the US. And so those rules went into place January 1st of 2006. And so dealers in precious metals, precious stones, and jewels have to comply with these regulations. And the penalties for non-compliance are like really aggressive. So it's actually quite important to make sure that we are following these regulations. And I'm going to tell you about what that actually means practically for your business. So who actually has to have an AML program? I think people are really confused about this a lot of the time, and it's complicated and hard to understand. So I'm going to do my best to make it practical for you. Okay, so the regulations apply to dealers who do $50,000 a year or more in the purchase and sale of covered goods. So covered goods include precious stones, precious metals, and then jewelry made from precious stones and precious metals, so long as 50% or more of the value comes from the precious stones or precious metals. That's really complicated, but I'll give you an example of something that probably isn't covered. So like if you're making a lucite cuff and there's some like, a couple pieces of turquoise embedded in the lucite, like that probably doesn't count for AML because the value is much more likely coming from the design of the piece than the actual precious gem turquoise that's embedded in the lucite cuff. So if you're doing jewelry that looks more like that, as opposed to, fine or, demi-fine jewelry, probably that's not covered under AML. Interestingly, a lot of watch brands think that a fair number of their watches are not covered by AML because if they're just plated with gold, but that like the value comes from the Swiss gears and the works and the craftsmanship and whatever it is, then like under these regulations, they might not actually be covered. Some of the watch brands have basically said, we're not covered. And some of them have said, we know that half of our stuff is covered, so we're just gonna have a program covering everything because it's easier than parsing out what is and is not covered. But that's basically how you know whether you have to have a program or not. So you have to hit that $50,000 threshold in purchase and sale. So that means you have to be buying at least $50,000 of those supplies and selling at least $50,000 of those supplies annually. If you are not, then you are exempt from maintaining an AML program. Retailers also have an exemption. So some retailers that only purchase from US dealers that already have an AML program don't have to have their own program. But if a retailer buys from the public, so like they'll buy gold off the street from someone just coming in to sell them something, if they buy from estate sales, auctions, or bankruptcy sales, or if they have any foreign suppliers, then they are not exempt and they do have to have a program addressing those areas. Why those areas? Essentially because those are all potential like suppliers that don't have an AML program or don't have AML requirements. So like a person coming in off the street doesn't have an AML program. Estate sales and auctions and bankruptcy sales, they don't have to have an AML program. And foreign businesses don't always have to have an AML program. So essentially it's like if a US retailer basically gets covered like an umbrella policy from all of its US suppliers, then it doesn't have to have one. This is a little complicated, so we are always happy to answer the question of do you or do you not have to have an AML program? So I just want to address that like the US government doesn't necessarily think that you are all laundering money. And in fact, we know that you're not. But, you know, jewelry businesses are at a higher level of risk for being used unknowingly for money laundering or terrorist financing, because we have really, really high dollar value items that are small and easily transportable. And not just that, but like you can get back a lot of money if you sell those products somewhere halfway around the world. So you could buy some diamonds in New York and fly to Surat and sell them there and get a lot of money back. And essentially it's just another way that, you know, criminal actors use the jewelry industry to sort of layer their transactions as part of a money laundering scheme. So I didn't put this slide in, and I regret not doing it, but usually I have a slide where I like talk about like how to launder money. But if you've ever watched like Ozark or literally any other television show, like you know how to launder money because they have literally told you how to do it. It's a real crime, and it's often part of a much larger criminal scheme. And so it's just one part of like a larger governmental effort to, you know, make sure that our businesses are not being used for this purpose. So it really, the regulations, you know, like help you position yourself to make sure that you actually understand your own supply chain and like who controls your business partners and what it is that we're doing here. And yeah, so looking at these questions in the chat before I go on, you know, so a retailer who carries jewelry from designers really leans on the designer carrying the AML program if the designer meets the qualifications. Yes, that's absolutely right. So retailers located in the US do have, you know, are relying on their suppliers to ensure that they have valid AML programs. And so if the retailer does have an AML program, that's when they would use the sort of like KYC form to identify their suppliers. But like it is even with these regulations, it's still a trust-based exercise, right? You are trusting that your supplier is going to give you the information that you're asking for about their business and that they do have an AML program in place. Do I know if JVC has an equivalent in Belgium or Europe? Unfortunately, we're very special. And there isn't anybody else globally quite like JVC, but there are other like national trade organizations that do some similar work to JVC. And Saskia, we can talk about that offline if you'd like. Okay.
Sara, could you say real quick what KYC stands for anyone who might not know?
Absolutely. So KYC technically stands for Know Your Customer, but we've sort of broadened that to really be Know Your Counterparty. So it's not just about identifying customers, it's really just about identifying all of your business partners. So, but that is KYC, Know Your Counterparty or Know Your Customer. And that actually just basically means like asking your business partner for some identification information so that you can be sure that you are dealing with a real business and a real person. So that includes getting information like their name and their address and their email address and sometimes their fax number if that's still relevant anywhere. But then also, you know, a government issued ID number. And that's the most important part. So you want to be able to make sure that you are dealing with like a legitimate entity. And so government issued ID number can be, you know, a driver's license number, a passport, a employer identification number, a social, all kinds of different things. That's actually like one of the sources of fun questions we get is sometimes we get questions from businesses being like, somebody wants to provide their California state bar license. Is that valid? You know, and so then we have to go do some research and say, okay, well, is it government issued? You know, and it turns out for California, the answer is yes. The California courts issue that number. So that is valid, but sometimes that's always, you know, a fun thing because some people are really weird about giving their personal.
Yeah, or the celebrities, right? Who you still have to show ID.
Yeah, totally. So we deal with that with some of the like high-end boutiques. They have celebrity clients who really don't want to give ID when they're doing wire transfers. And we're like, sorry, you still have to. Okay, so what does an AML program actually look like if this is new to you? There are 5 parts to a compliant AML program. First is appointing a compliance officer. That's the person who's in charge of the AML program at the business. It has to be an employee. And it has to be somebody who is positioned to like make decisions on behalf of the company about certain transactions. The second part is conducting a risk assessment, and that's evaluating all of the areas of your business where you might be at risk for being used for money laundering or terrorist financing. So a risk assessment might look at whether you accept cash payments, for example, because that can be a riskier area, or whether you have foreign suppliers, or whether you do business in Instagram DMs, you know, like things like that. All areas where like people who are unknown to you might come in and try to, you know, do business with you. Then next you write your AML program and policy document, and that is where KYC comes in because that includes KYC. And that is based on your risk assessment. So you basically done the risk assessment and decided, okay, these are our areas where we are at risk. Here's all the policies we're going to create to address those areas of risk. The fourth part is employee training. So you have to train all of your employees if you have them, and make sure that everybody understands what money laundering is and how to comply. And then the last part is periodic testing. So we say about once a year, you should be going in to test your program to make sure it's working. So that is, then the testing part, both the implementation of an AML program and the testing part are something that JVC provides as a service. We do have like an easily accessible program with Jewelers Mutual called Jewel Pack, where you can like go on a website and spend some time answering some questions and filling in some forms, and then it'll spit out your AML program for you. Or we have our own kit, which is more of like a DIY option, or you can hire me to come in and do it for you, but that's a lot. And then we also provide independent testing if that is something that is required for your business. A lot of banks end up asking for that. So like the way people get sort of backed into compliance is oftentimes their bank will say to them, hey, you're supposed to have an AML program. Do you have one? Can we see it? And the reason the banks are very concerned about this is because they also have their own AML obligations. And so they are required to not just have their own AML program, but to make sure that their clients who have AML obligations are also following them.
Sarah, quick question. What would trigger the bank to require that info from
Great
one of us?
question. If you tell them that you are selling jewelry, that is often a trigger. So the banks all have their own compliance departments, and their responsibilities are to sort of like go through their long roster of clients and say like, hey, your bank account has the word jewelry in it, so that must mean that you need an AML program. Here's a 12,000 page survey that you need to fill out about your AML program. And that's a thing that we, you know, for JVC members and for AML clients, we will help you fill out those kinds of forms and make sure that you're answering those questions appropriately. But the bank itself does try to identify what businesses it has that have AML obligations. All right. So I just want to note that like, we think that this is part of like a larger framework of, you know, sort of like responsible sourcing, and how do you actually start stepping back into your supply chain and asking customers for, and suppliers for information. And that KYC framework is a great way to start doing that. And then you can sort of build that out from there. The actual like standardized KYC form is just a page. And a lot of businesses will use that to sort of like build out like a vendor information packet, or, customer identification forms or applications or things like that. And of course, like on a smaller scale, you have a lot less leverage, I think, than a larger business. But it is still part of your requirements. So one way that you can get your business partner to start answering these kinds of questions is to emphasize, like, look, this is required under my AML program. And like, I actually need you to fill out these forms because I have a legal requirement. So it's a good way for small businesses to get a little bit leverage with their larger suppliers, and do a little bit of further evaluation. You can further start to evaluate your business partners and whether you actually want to work with them by, asking deeper questions about things that are important to your business, using JBT credit reports, search engine results. There's like outside evaluators and trade references and things like that. You can sort of like add on to your identification form, but that's sort of where we start. And then of course, like AML fits into this sort of like larger responsible sourcing strategy. It's one part of this sort of like larger multi-agency effort to combat money corruption and terrorism. And the compliance officer who's in charge of the AML program really is empowered by these regulations to step back into the supply chain and check on this information and stay aware of, global financing conversations. There's like larger sort of global agencies like FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, that sort of sets these sort of like these like financial global standards and goals. And then each individual country implements those different goals to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. So you make this sort of like a normal part of your operations and your evaluation of your suppliers and your customers. And, it can help you prioritize ethical business. And then I just wanted to quickly note that I think you've probably talked a lot about the OECD, their 5-step framework for due diligence, but you'll see that like it kind of maps to AML regulations. So it's, strong company management systems, identifying and assessing risks in the supply chain, designing and implementing strategies, carrying out third-party audits, and then reporting out. So it's not exactly the same, but it's like a very similar structure to those AML regulations, which sort of can help you feed into that framework as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Tiff to talk about the FTC Guides.
Thanks, Sarah. AML, we really, just to reiterate, I can't resist. We really do feel, and we're trying to push this mantra, we really do feel like AML is the building block of responsible sourcing, because if you're doing your AML program right, you can sort of add on additional questions, and you're like on your way to having, to asking the right questions and to pulling these issues of responsibility out of pure marketing into the actual operations of your business, which I'm sure everyone in this forum is already doing, but it's just like a little bit of a passion project for Sarah and I, that we really want people to make these things much more real. So FTC Guides. So now we're turning back over to that advertising side of things that we do. So there is the Federal Trade Commission. They're trying to protect the US consumer. So they want to make sure that the US consumer, whatever they're consuming or buying, isn't being deceived by advertising. They have some really broad edicts and rules that apply to the entire US market. And then for industries or products that they feel are especially tricky, complicated, confusing, or prone to possibly being deceptive, they've issued like special guides on top of that. And we're in jewelry, we're one of those industries that's seen as being particularly complicated and tricky. So we have our own set of guides that talk exactly about how we can and can't advertise jewelry. Those were changed and updated formally in 2018. And I think it's in this presentation later, but on our website, we have a free guide. We made this beautiful little guide that breaks down everything you need to know, really accessible. You can use it if you've got a marketing consultant that you work with or someone junior on your team who does marketing. Thank you so much, Rachel, for putting up the link. It's free. And really just common sense language, and you can just grab what you need to make sure that you're advertising jewelry in the right way. So that's the jewelry guides. The green guides are a separate set of guidelines from the FTC, and that applies to the entire US market. And that is what sets the rules for eco claims, green claims, etc. And those are going to be up for revision next year because the definitions we're working with are like super, super old and out of date. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then the guides show examples of the sort of right and wrong ways to go about all this stuff. So, like I said, we just went through the process for the jewelry guides. We got fresh guidance as of 2018. We've got that for you at your fingertips on the JVC website. Covers all of our jewelry products. There were some, controversial changes made, particularly about lab-grown diamonds, which the reality is a little bit more nuanced than what some of the people on social media were talking about. Funny how that seems to happen with every topic, but they did make some big changes. So we're really hopeful that as we head into the green guides process in 2023, that we will actually end up at the end of the process with a working definition of sustainability. So the way it will work is the FTC has said that, and I'm going into more detail here because we are actually about to face this, and we're really hoping that the people in this forum will be some of our greatest co-creators of the new reality that we're going to be working on. So the FTC, but by the end of this calendar year, they said they're going to drop this series of questions, this series of like legally questions, and that's going to be sort of a secret code indicator of what it is they care about sustainability and eco claims. So then the minute that drops, Sarah and I and the rest of our team will come back to you guys and the rest of JVC members in industry to start to put together our advocacy, what we want out of this process. And we're only going to have 30 days, maybe 60 days to gather all that information, have those debates, and then distill it all into this like very formal legal brief that we'll then submit as our sort of opening salvo in this conversation. The FTC will then turn around, they'll take in our comments, they'll take in comments from every other industry and what they want, and then they'll come out with the draft. We'll comment again, they'll probably go back again. And so it'll just be sort of an extended conversation and very formalized debate that at the very end of it, we'll end up with the rules and the new reality we'll all be living by. But we really feel like it's crucial in this first 30, 60-day comment process that we set the stakes for what we want as an industry. And I think so many people really are hungry for a better, more meaningful version of sustainability and eco claims, some scientific data that means something a little bit more, right? All kinds of things are possible. We look at some of the things that are happening in Europe, they're getting really technical and really scientific, and the stakes are very real and getting very high for these claims. We'd love to see a version of that in the US. But the thing that I think Sarah and I worry about is this isn't just about jewelry anymore, like it was the last time we went through this process. This is about every industry in the US. And so we're going to team up with our friends in apparel, shoes, who knows, cosmetics, maybe. We'll have similar issues to other industries, but jewelry, we're weird, right? So there's going to be things that we're going to want that nobody else is going to want, or that they might want the opposite of. The example we always use is recycled. We're going to probably want something different for recycled, the way we deal with it in metals, than the way that many other industries deal with it. So anyway, so just we're raring to go, as you can tell, but we just really think this is going to be an important process. And I know that a lot of people on this call are truly passionate about these issues. And so we really hope that you'll communicate with us openly and help us define our position as this becomes real. We'll get the chance to do that by the end of this calendar year.
Can I jump in for 1 second? I
Please.
know I'm like jumping the queue on people's questions and stuff, but that is such an important opportunity that's on our doorstep for that language. And if, you know, I know like the Alliance for Responsible Mining has someone on the call today. The Watch and Jewelry Initiative 2030 is on the call today. You know, like, so there are organizations who have the capacity to bring data to, you know, to bring scientific data to those kinds of claims. And so we're definitely in a new era from when those would have been written originally, and then deciding what greenhouse gas emissions data is going to qualify then to be able to produce a claim, or what kind of supply chain traceability information is going to then qualify as being able to use, you know, legally use the language. Just trying to emphasize the significance of the work.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Yeah, and someone asked a question about the EU, and the EU and the UK both have things sort of at the finish line. And forgive me, I'm not remembering all the acronyms right now. Nawal might, who's on the call, might be able to help us out. But they have like 13-point, 17-point scientific data that has to be shown, you know, at the risk of the penalty is then like 7% of your revenue next year if you get it wrong. So, you know, the stakes, the EU and the UK are sort of starting to set some real high stakes. And I wouldn't be surprised if the US came right behind them, because let's be real, right? Like there is, please don't put this as one of the takeaways, but like there is no definition right now. People can basically get away with that, whatever they want, until they hit the wall of fraud. And that's got to stop. And that is going to stop. And I think that it will be a huge change of the way of doing business for a lot of people, which I think ultimately will be a good thing, but will be a big transformation process for a lot of people. So just a little note, because I'm still sort of talking about the jewelry guides as I'm also talking about the green guides. The jewelry guides did come online in 2018. What happens is, you know, this sort of makes sense, common sense, right? Like the FTC says, okay, here are the new rules, everyone, you know, sound the trump, play the trumpet, here we go, it's official and it's announced. They put it out there, and then they sort of watch the market. And when they see people doing the wrong thing, they take some kind of action against them to say, hey, no, we really mean it. We made these new rules. Here are the people doing it wrong, and we'll start escalating enforcement against them. So for the jewelry guides, then in 19, they did come out and they warned 8 different companies around lab-grown diamond issues, around using eco-friendly, eco-conscious, sustainable without, you know, what right now it's very little that's required. You just have to show a reasonable basis for those claims, some substantiation, some kind of data. And the caveat there is it can't be like comparables. It has to be about, it's not like I'm better than that guy. It's like, you've got to be good on your own and be able to show the data on your own. And that's where we are right now. I feel like I've kind of already covered this one, but like I said, as it stands, it's very loose. I mean, basically, if you're making this claim, you just have to be able to qualify it with some specific environmental benefits, but that is a very wide category as of right now. And again, this applies to every product in the US market. If I won't read all of these to you, but you see here that these are the types of claims regulated in the green guides. But again, it still is very loose. I mean, we have some rules here, but yeah, exactly. No sustainability, no definition of sustainable, no rules around how to use that, or responsibly sourced. Again, what does it really mean? Basically nothing. I mean, I don't know how people on the call feel. I know some of our members have just sort of stopped using these words for now, and instead just come to their consumer with the details of what they are doing, whether that's philanthropy, whether that's you know, what exactly is going on with their sourcing, how they're checking along the supply chain. And Sarah already touched on some of the OECD and other frameworks, and I'm sure everyone in this forum is very familiar with all of these pre-existing frameworks. Yeah, and we built out a nice part of our website. I'm sure, again, a lot of the people on this call, you guys are already like PhD level in this stuff. But if you want, it's pretty dense, no surprise from us, but it's pretty dense. But what we've built out, some nice content around responsible sourcing in case you ever want to cut and paste or grab anything or point consumers towards it. It'll give you a nice, deeper understanding. And sorry, someone asked if it's private companies or publicly held. Do you mean the SEC stuff? Oh, okay, right. So the SEC stuff, yeah, I mean, obviously would be public traded companies, but we really believe there would be very strong after effects of any enforcement that they start to do. And as background, the SEC has been the surprise contender that actually has some teeth behind them and has started doing some regulations around emissions. Yeah, so again, it's pretty easy breezy right now, but if you are making sourcing claims, you do just want to be specific and you do want to have that scientific data behind you. Don't make like super broad claims. Oh, and here we have a slide about it. Yeah, so the SEC has proposed a rule that would require publicly traded companies to report climate change risks to their operations. And this has had a really big shock effect in a lot of other industries, not quite ours yet. But here we see some sort of, regulation starting to take shape. And this might be an indicator of what's to come from the FTC. And of course, the FTC only is looking at advertising claims, but I think another important takeaway from this action by the SEC is that we might see multi-agency, and I think we will see multi-agency efforts getting involved on making sure that sustainability really means something and that we're like protecting our planet. And I think an interesting case study, and I could be wrong, I don't think we even have anything about Russia sanctions in this presentation, which is like a whole other thing, and we can get into it in the questions if people want to. But one thing we're seeing, because diamonds were sanctioned specifically this year, and we've seen this presidential administration take a really novel approach to enforcement. We saw the DOJ doing all kinds of things they don't normally do. At the federal government level, it's like any other group of humans. There's tons of sibling rivalry. And like a lot of times the agencies, are very territorial about, I do this, you do that, you won't interfere with me. But we're seeing at the agency level a lot more harmonization and cooperation on going after enforcement for Russia sanctions. So there's no reason to think they wouldn't also pull that across for regulating sustainability and eco claims. And here we see, the SEC taking a bold first step. Who knows how the FTC follows, what other agencies might get involved.
Yeah, and just jumping in there, Tiff and I had the opportunity to participate in something called the Summit for Democracy, which is another sort of like multi-agency effort to bolster democracy around the world. It's I think a US generated effort, but there's like tons of partners from globally, NGOs, different US agencies and things like that. And it's it was a Biden-Harris administration priority when they started their presidency. So I think that too has been encouraging sort of like this multi-agency effort to combat corruption and bolster democracy globally.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. And when you set the stakes at anti-corruption, you can see easily how some of these environmental things get involved, how anti-money laundering falls under that. So we just see broader and broader nets around all of these issues. So again, just to underscore disclosure, really honing in on that advertising. The whole purpose of all this with the FTC is they're trying to protect that US consumer. And they're really thinking about who is just a regular old person, you know, who is somebody who's not involved in the industry that they're regulating. What would someone who really has no knowledge of the jewelry industry assume or think about this ad in its totality? They know that the average person is looking at maybe multiple screens at the same time. So they really don't like it, and they really react badly if you try to be cute and like make the type really small, or like hide things or put things on other pages. Like, that does not count as disclosure. It has to be really, really obvious. It has to be right. If it's a disclosure you're supposed to be making, it's got to be right up front. It's got to be easy to understand. And the formula that they use, or the percentage they use, is not like would a majority of Americans understand it. We've heard in a hearing we were at with them, 11%. I don't know how they chose this. Would if it would fool if it would fool 11% of the population, that's what they consider like the average person. So it's a really low bar. So you really, really, really have to make it super obvious. And again, it's in totality. So if you just like look at the ad, would someone understand that this is what you're selling them? And an important thing to note right now that we're like kind of fully shopping online and doing so many things digitally, please keep this at the top of your mind when you're doing things on social media, because you just want to, again, make that someone scrolling, they're going to understand, like, for example, that it's lab grown versus natural for a diamond. Just make that like extra obvious. And part of the conspicuous thing is it has to be before they add to cart. So you got to do all this before people add to cart. And Sarah, I think I'm turning it back over to you, right?
Yeah.
All right.
So I'm going to talk about some of the, just a couple highlights from the FTC guides of things that we think are really important to know. These are just hand-picked a couple of issues from the whole guides. And again, please do go download the JVC guide to this, because we cover a lot more topics. But just briefly, in the US, if you rhodium plate a product, you have to disclose it, and you have to assure the reasonable durability of the coating. And the reason this happens is because we were getting calls, and the FTC was getting calls of people saying, my white gold jewelry is tarnishing and it's not real. But it turned out it was just rhodium plated and it was wearing off, and people didn't know anything about it, and they didn't know that they could get it re-rhodium plated. So that's part of why this exists. There is specific terminology that you do need to use if you are using laboratory grown diamonds. And so if you're using a natural diamond, you can just say the word diamond. You don't have to say natural or mined or earth diamond, or whatever kind of creative terminology that you might use. You can just say the word diamond, and that means it's a natural diamond from the ground. For laboratory grown diamonds, the terminology is laboratory grown, laboratory created, or manufacturer name created. So if I had my own line of lab grown diamonds, I could say Sara created diamond. There's also sort of like a fourth category that they have, where you can use, they're like, if you can use some other word or phrase of like meaning to describe that the product is, lab grown and not mined. It's sort of like a catch-all thing. We strongly recommend not trying to go out on a limb, because it's just so much more risky than using the terminology. They've given you a gift. They've said, hey, these are the 3 ways that we think you should be doing this. So you note there that the FTC removed the term synthetic from their recommended terminology. Doesn't mean that you can't use it, but they basically said there was a bunch of evidence that consumers confused the word synthetic with simulated. And so the truth is that the FTC was like, look, this is confusing consumers. They don't understand what the word synthetic means. So like, let's not recommend that anymore. Obviously, in certain situations, that is going to be the right word. So like a lot of laboratories still use the word synthetic because it's a scientific word. And then also in translating documents from other languages, oftentimes other languages don't have the same lab grown or lab created language that we have in English. And so they'll use the word synthetic, and that's totally appropriate, especially when translating documents. And just another note here that like the use of the terms real, genuine, natural, and precious can only be used for natural products. You can't use these words to describe a manufactured or artificial product. So that means that if you are using a laboratory grown diamond, technically under the guides, you are not supposed to use the words real, genuine, natural, or precious to describe that product. You will now see violations of this literally everywhere you look on the internet. But that is part of the FTC guides. So it's something important to remember to avoid if you're using lab grown or simulated material. And then finally, I just want to briefly highlight this section of the FTC jewelry guides about the use of the term handmade. It's a really, really incredibly narrow definition. So products can be called handmade or hand wrought when the entire shaping or forming of the product is from certain raw materials, and the finishing is hand labor, and it's all manually controlled methods that permit the maker to control and vary the construction, shape, design, and finish. So basically that means if you're using CAD, you are no longer in the handmade category. And that sounds insane to every jeweler on this call, I am sure. But if you do use like any kind of like, mechanical process, you're no longer in the handmade category. And then there's that like second bullet point there is the list of all of the items that are considered raw materials that will qualify you for handmade or hand wrought. I think interestingly there, you'll see that like faceted gemstones are not on that list. So if you're using faceted gemstones, technically you're no longer in the handmade category because someone was using a machine to facet those gemstones. Also totally insane. And I think that like there are lots of really interesting and artful ways to get around this, restriction. You can say that something is, hand engraved or it's hand set or, like things like that. There's ways to describe what you are doing without violating this regulation, but it's important to know that it exists. And now you have that information. And then we also just sort of wanted to touch on Made in USA, and I'm realizing now that this slide is totally out of order, but whatever. So this is not in the FTC guides, but this is a different rule. So the Federal Trade Commission regulates claims of made in USA or made in America. It is an actual rule, which actually is stronger than all of these guides that we talked about. The guides are simply guidance on how the FTC would interpret claims. A rule is something that has more teeth behind it for the FTC. They have more enforcement capability. So if you are going to call a product made in the USA, and that also includes things like made in New York or made in Brooklyn or made in California, all or virtually all of the components of that product must originate in the United States in order to call it made in USA. So if you're now thinking about jewelry and where all of our components come from, you're realizing that almost no jewelry can be called technically actually made in the USA. This is not just about jewelry, much like the green guides. This is an existing doctrine that applies to all industries. And if you look at the case law for cases that have been brought under this regulation, the most recent ones that I thought were particularly interesting was one about hockey pucks that were not actually made in the US. There's a hat one where like this hat company in St. Louis was claiming that their hats were made in USA, but their material was actually coming from all over the place. Shinola actually had a made in USA case for a while because they were calling their products made in Detroit, but their gears were coming from Switzerland. So they got dinged under these regulations. And then most recently, I think like a promotional items company that was saying their products are made in USA, but they were actually all manufactured in China. So again, along with the handmade conversation, there are ways to make qualified claims here that you can actually legally use. So you can say it's designed in New York or made in the USA with the world's finest materials. There are ways to indicate what it is that you're actually doing without violating this regulation. If you look at the back of any Apple product, it just says designed in California. Because of course they want to show that like they're doing something in the United States, but they're manufacturing in China. So again, there are ways to make sure that you're making claims about where your products are being made without violating this rule. And that includes qualifying. So you can just say, made in New York with Italian gold or, things like that. And then I kept this in because this is my favorite part of the guides revision. So as Tiff said, in 2018, we had a guides revision, and I had drafted this in our submission to the FTC, and they took it wholesale and they put it right in the guides, and I'm very proud of it. But it's unfair or deceptive to use the incorrect varietal name for a product. So you can't use the term yellow emerald to describe golden beryl or heliodor, because yes, it is beryl, but it's yellow. It's not an emerald. So don't call it an emerald. And that applies for green amethyst. You can't really use that either, because it has a trade name. It has its own name. So those are just some thoughts about trade names that are still used in the industry, and my tiny little pet project. So as Tiff said, we do have a free resource for understanding the FTC guides, and that's available for download. So yay, that's available. And then the last sort of like major point we wanted to touch on today was about trademarks and hallmarking. So in the United States, there is no sort of like central hallmarking agency where you have to submit your jewelry for evaluation. Instead, the National Gold and Silver Stamping Act, which was passed in 1906 and signed into law by President Teddy Roosevelt, requires that if you stamp your precious metal item with a quality mark, so like 14K or 925, you are required to also stamp your federally registered trademark on the item. And your trademark acts as a guarantee of fineness for this essentially hallmarking. So you have to take whatever little maker's mark symbol that you're using and make sure you get that registered with the Patent and Trademark Office here in the United States. And then you can comply with that law. And I'll tell you just a tiny bit about how you do that. You have to file an application with the US Patent and Trademark Office. There are filing fees. They're generally about $450 per category. You would be filing in category 14, which is the jewelry category. We strongly recommend hiring an experienced trademark attorney to do this for you. It's generally a flat fee, somewhere under $1,500, like not a ton of money in the grand scheme of things, but the process is highly technical. Missing deadlines can be really costly. They've actually, the trademark office has just shortened they normally had like a 6-month response time where you were allowed to reply to them within 6 months. They've actually just cut that in half to 3 months. So they've made it even more challenging to like do the technical part. And then once you get registration, after 5 years, you have to renew your trademark filing with another filing with the USPTO. So that's why it's like really helpful to have an attorney, because they'll track that for you, and they'll remind you like, hey, we have to submit your 5-year filing. So that's how you comply with this regulation in the US. And just quickly to note, if you don't have a registered trademark, you also don't have to mark your jewelry in the US with fineness. It's not required. So you don't have to put 925 or 14K on your product. And like, if you want to just put a mark in it that is your maker's mark that's not registered without a fineness mark, you can also do that. So there's ways of dealing with this, but it is a requirement. If you want to mark with fineness, you have to have a registered trademark and mark it with that. In a lot of other countries, there's a lot of people on this call who are much more well-versed on this than I am, because you are in other countries. But in many other countries, jewelers are actually required to submit their pieces for assay in advance of selling in country. So in the UK, for example, all pieces sold in the country, like literally everything, has to be evaluated and hallmarked by a third party. So that's when you like go to the Birmingham assay, for example, and you send all of your products to them, and then they test everything, and then they put a little stamp on it and say, yep, okay, we've approved this. The EU has like a common control mark that'll allow you to sell in like the signatory countries. And if you're going to sell anywhere else, it just requires a little bit of research before exporting. And I will note specifically that the Birmingham assay has always been really good about answering my questions about hallmarking in other countries. So they're a great resource, because they know everything about hallmarking. So that's where I would go if you have questions about a specific country and you can't find information. And then I think I'll turn it back to Tiff for just a little concluding before we get to questions.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I saw there's some questions that piled up in the chat. Maybe you guys have some more. And also we're happy to talk about sanctions if anybody wants to do that on a Friday afternoon. But yeah, we'd love for you to be a member, and if you're not already, and it is a process. We do kind of hand verify everybody who applies. We look at your website, make sure that you're in compliance with everything. And if you're not, we'll kind of coach you to get to where you need to be. So we'd love to have you if you're not already a member. And thank you. Rachel from our team is on the call and is giving you that link. We also do an in-person, if you guys are coming for 24 Karat Weekend, which is now in March, we only do one event a year, one in-person event a year. And on March 17th, we'll have an in-person luncheon that is our fundraising luncheon. So we'd love for you to come to that if you are in New York City. And I think we can turn to questions. I think that's it. I mean, we might have our contact. Yeah, here's our contact info. If you want to contact us. But with that, turn it back over to Christina and any questions people have.
Yeah, so Anna and Cecilia from my team, questions definitely piled up. Do you want to, let's go back kind of toward the beginning, some of the things in the order in which they were received is what I'm trying to say. Anna, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. So one of the first questions came from Christina Molly. Sorry, if I should check how to say your name properly, you can let us know. If you want to jump on and kind of expand on it, but you're welcome to, but I'll read it out. It was, how do we independent designers know if a gemstone wholesaler or gold vendor / refiner has ever been accused of failing to be AML compliant? Is there any way to check online or in some public facing way?
There's nothing necessarily that will tell you about whether they were like accused of not having an AML program. One of the parts of an AML program that does exist though is that you're supposed to search your business partners on something called the OFAC SDN list. OFAC stands for the Office of Foreign Assets Control. It's part of the Treasury Department, and SDN stands for Specially Designated Nationals. It's a long, long list of all of the entities and businesses and people globally that US citizens are not allowed to do business with because they are known terrorists, money launderers, drug cartel runners, all the bad people. So we recommend that as part of an AML program on a small scale, you should be looking at that list, taking once a quarter, taking a chunk of your suppliers and searching them on that list to make sure they don't appear. If you go in right now and you type in the word Alrosa, you will see that they are on that list because we cannot directly do business with them. They have been added to that list. It's really, really hard to get off that list once you're on. It's also a very, very long list. There is an option to download it. Don't recommend that. It'll crash your computer, and there is like a Boolean search availability there. So you can just like go in and do put in a name like it was a Google search, and that is much more recommended, and also because the list gets updated every day, so having a static list is not worth it.
Thank you. Could you also say, like, what is a sanction? Like, what does that mean? Are there different levels of it that have different consequences? Just really practically what it means.
Yeah, so sanctions are tools that governments use to try to make foreign policy happen. So they're kind of like penalties or restrictions. So like right now, the sanctions on Russia are all of these penalties or restrictions on Russia's ability to do business with the United States in order to A, punish them for their unjustified invasion of Ukraine, but also B, to prevent US funds from going to fund that illegal war. So it's about blocking US money from getting to bad foreign actors.
And
Thank
the
you.
punishments range as well, from financial consequences to criminal charges.
That's great to know. Thank you. So I'm going back through the questions that we copied from the chat. The next one we have is also from Christina Mall. And then we get into, there was a lot of very specific questions about the handmade rules. So Christina's second question was, how can a gold refinery have an ad with a tree coming out of its logo if it is buying gold from markets in the UAE? What does the tree have to do with anything? If their definition of recycled includes investment gold, it may not be 100% post-consumer recycled. How can a refiner have ads that are out of sync with commonly understood terms?
Yeah, I mean, that's where we are, right? This is why we're so excited that we're finally going to have a revision of the green guides, because I think they'd be fun. I don't know what, Sarah, what you think. I mean, I think they would get away with it with the picture of the tree. Conversely, with Made in the USA, because it's a stronger rule, you can't have like a picture of an American flag to sort of wink, wink, imply that things are made in the USA. That is like explicitly not okay. But I think in this instance, like they'd probably just get away with that because we just don't have the rules that are in harmony with the times that we're living in quite yet.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to being helping I'll be a part of that revision. Really excited for that. Okay, so yeah, there was a lot of talk in the chat when we were discussing the rules around handmade. I think a lot of us here, really want to understand how we can best convey how special the things that we make are, but still follow these rules. So, questions like, what about using a flex shaft? Does that kind of machine mean the work is not handmade? What about old cut?
Shaft is. So if someone could educate me on what that is, then I might be able to tell you.
Yeah, Sharon's like pointing behind her. She's in her studio.
Yes, show and tell.
It's
a rotary tool.
It's a rotary tool that you use a foot pedal. You have to use your hand on the hand piece and then your foot on the foot pedal. It's sort of like a sewing machine in a way.
Okay.
Or I would say that like, and I asked the question specifically because I'm a part of like other crafting communities where this question has also come up around, say, like clothing. Is clothing handmade if you've used a sewing machine to make it? It's not hand sewn.
Right.
But you've used a machine using your hands to push it through. So a flex shaft has a similar functionality where like you use your hands and your feet to operate it, but it is a machine. So does jewelry count as handmade if you've had to use something like that too?
Yeah. So basically, like our general interpretation of this is machinery knocks you out. And that's not necessarily the best answer, but it's the answer that we have at the moment. And like I feel like I've been talking about this specific regulation a lot in the last couple months, also because we have a new lawyer on our team and she had like 1,000 questions about it. And she had all of these new scenarios and she's like, well, what about this? What about this? And I was like, I don't know. So the next time we talk to the FTC, I'm actually thinking about bringing it up just because like, there's a lot of questions in this area, but the safest answer for you is machinery, computers, knocks you out of handmade. So let's think about other ways to talk about what it is you're actually doing.
Okay.
And I think I saw later in the chat that there was somebody asking like, what about hand wrought, or handcrafted? One thing to know about the FTC is they don't like cleverness. I think Tiff said this earlier. They like synonyms don't count. So like handmade, handcrafted, hand created, things like that, like a different way of saying the same thing, like it's not going to change. So it's the same thing with Made in USA. It's like Made in USA, Made in America, crafted in America, things like that. It's the terminology itself is not necessarily about the specific words, but it's about what you are trying to convey.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So I guess there was one more question about, gemstones that were cut by hand. So say you fabricate everything, meaning, you are forming it by hand, you're soldering it, and you have a hand cut gemstone. That I feel like that's probably one of the few cases where you could say handmade, handcrafted jewelry piece.
Totally. Knock yourself out. Go ahead and do it.
Okay. Good to know.
I'll just
see.
jump in with the
So I
question,
think,
that easy one that came up. Will, I think, asked about any like templated contracts, and that is a feature that we have behind our membership paywall. So if you're a JVC member, you log into the website, you have this whole dashboard of all these like training videos and materials for you. And one of the sections is what do we call it? Our forms bank or something equally scintillating, that we have a bunch of like jewelry specific contracts that you can use as inspiration. We don't give legal advice, so we wouldn't say, oh, just totally cut and paste, but like, you can use it as a template, and we're rolling out more and more of those. So if you see something there that's missing that you'd like to see, let us know, because we'll write it for you and get it up there.
okay.
Wait, hold on. I got a
any-
DM about hands so hold on. A DM saying, can I please mention about polishing machines? And yeah, so like polish, same thing, it's machinery. So like it probably knocks you out of the handmade consideration, which is like horrifying, I'm aware. But just
Doesn't
something.
make any sense because this is not like plasticine, we need tools.
Yeah, totally. The definition is very strict, and that's why we have such a hard time with it. But if you're going to go by the literal boxed in definition, that's what it is. And again, like, we have to make sure that when we are talking about our products, that we're doing it in a way that like honors the spirit of like what the FTC is trying to do. But like in their minds, of course, like they're trying to protect businesses who are hand making products from other businesses who aren't doing that, making those claims. So that's why it's so strict. But we will take it up with them.
Yeah, that's why it's so
yeah,
good.
thanks for that clarification. Go ahead, Tiffany.
Yeah, no, that's why it's so great to talk to you guys, because we can bring the flex shaft up next time we see them. We had no idea how important it was, and they'd have no clue, rest assured. So it's super helpful.
And Tiffany, just to come in on this one, gemstones are cut by hand, but also using a machine. So it's like a record player, and you put like the gem on like a dop, and it goes down, and it's technically a machine that's literally precision cutting. And that's involves a machine. So I don't know how any gemstone could possibly not be
right.
Use that, not get in trouble there.
Yeah.
Unless you're using rough. And even
Yeah.
rough.
So to adjust, yeah. So to adjust my earlier statement, really the only thing you could say is handmade is if you're fabricating a piece completely from scratch, just metal.
Yep.
I have a friend who for a long time worked as the master, so one of the silversmiths at Colonial Williamsburg, and literally hearing this description, his practices are the only practices that would fit this definition. It's pretty funny. Should we segue? We have some comments about how the laws differ in Europe. I have one that I would like to get to about sourcing. Where should we head to next?
Yeah, I think let's go ahead with your question, Christina.
Yeah, and then maybe Stuart Poole's Herkimer Diamond kind of stuff. I had a question. So when it comes to AML, what triggers a bank? Are banks jumpy or touchy about certain places where materials may come from? So for instance, we have, Christina Villegas is on, we have initiatives supporting artisanal and small scale miners in all materials all over the world, right? And so I have heard cases where someone has said, I am purchasing gold from X country. And the bank is like, I really wish you didn't tell me. Essentially, was the message that you had said, where you're going to be purchasing from, because now, no, we're not going to give you the loan to buy that material. So for the most part, folks are buying through US refineries when it comes to gold, for example, or they're buying through US based dealers. But like, what do you know, what insights, if you have them, you know, on certain triggering countries? Obviously, if they are somehow on the sanctions list, you know, that would be an obvious one. But for instance, we're working on a project for gold coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Next year, it could become available. And I'm worried for jewelers that are purchasing, even though they won't be purchasing, the bill won't say gold from DRC, right? They're going to buy it from the UK or they're going to buy it from the US. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Lots.
Yes, so many. Yes, we know that like banks definitely get really hinky about like certain countries and even not certain countries. I worked with an AML client that's like a super high-end retail jewelry store on Fifth Avenue here in New York, like very, very well known. And they banked with a certain bank for a number of years, and I had been doing their AML testing. And one day, like 6 months, like we usually test once a year, and in between, the president of the company called me in a panic and said, "Sara, our bank is threatening to shut our account down." And I was like, "Well, but we comply. Like we have all the AML regulations. Like, let me see what they're asking you." And they were asking for, all this documentation, which we provided. And even though we provided all the information, the bank was like, "Yeah, we're going to close your account in 30 days. We don't want to. You're too risky." They think that jewelry is a risky area, which it is risky. We all know why, right? So it's certainly, some banks have just decided like, hey, we're not willing to like bank jewelry or diamonds or things like that anymore because it's just a huge area of risk. There are lots of other banks are still banking. In particular, here in New York, I know that like TD and KeyBank are both like pretty big like bankers for the industry, at least here in New York. And part of it depends on like how annoying the bank's compliance department is. And by how annoying, I mean like how fully built out it is. Also, you can't talk to them. Like normal people with bank accounts, like you will never get to the compliance department. It will all get filtered through other people in the business. So that's also part of the problem, because sometimes we are asked to say like, hey, this business is exempt from AML regulations. They don't have to have it. And like that level of nuance isn't really accessible at the banking level. So it's really complicated, and there's not a great solution other than have an AML program and tell them and comply and, be proactive about making sure that these guidelines are in place so that you're ready when they ask you for it.
Yeah, and with the Russia sanctions specifically, ongoing, maybe more attention on diamond, maybe new attention on gold, this is only going to continue to increase, and the trigger is only going to be more of a hair trigger of banks not wanting to deal with our industry. And like Sara said, these compliance departments are like huge, and the people maybe running this first line of dinging people there's a lot of turnover. I mean, you're not going to like, if you do have the unlucky instance of being dinged for this, like you definitely want to have your program in like a separate place ready to go to say, no, I'm good. I'm okay. You don't have to worry about me. Because if you have to stop what you're doing and create an AML program at that point, we don't want anyone to be in that situation.
Mm-hmm. And it dovetails with, at this moment in time, again, with ASM, we're trying to create a culture among downstream businesses to source. And in order to do that, we have to sort of de-risk for purchasers, to make a more amenable climate to supporting materials from artisanal small-scale miners. And so the message you're giving us right now and our desire to kind of make it easier for this uptake are like bashing against each other. They very clearly clash. And so the banking industry sounds like another area where we have to be doing our work to educate them on these initiatives. Thanks for answering that.
Yeah, and we're part of initiatives at the Treasury Department where they bring together everybody who's regulated by AML. So that's mostly banks, one maybe casino company, and then we've asserted ourselves and now we're included in all those. So we get a little bit of face time with these bank people a couple times a year just to kind of like plead our case, and hopefully it will help. Who knows what the actual results are, but we're out there trying as best we can to make sure that our jewelry voice is heard by the government and also by the banks themselves. Someone here asked a question about bespoke. That's super interesting because it definitely like implies handmade, but I feel like it's like not such a broadly used term in the US. So I'm not sure if you used it in a US facing ad, if that would cause a problem or not. Sarah, what do you think?
I think that's a potentially good one.
Yeah.
Great.
Personal opinion.
Love that. I like that word. Okay, so I have one more question that I've been thinking about for a bit. And if it's, kind of too specific and there's not really an answer for it yet, I totally understand. But this came up at the Chicago conference. There was a panel including, Mark Hanna and Eric Ronwart from Columbia Gem House, as well as Pauline Mundia, who's from the Federation of Small Scale Mining Associations in Zambia. And so the conversation was around the SEC guidelines for carbon reporting. And it began with Mark Hanna, because it's obviously the rules are aimed at public companies, right? But because they have to start considering, the different scopes that they're reporting, it eventually trickles down to the artisanal space, which seems like a really, really big burden to place on them. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can work to kind of help relieve that burden, if there's anything that we can do. If I understood it correctly, there is space for companies to kind of report on behalf of their suppliers. I don't know if that's true. Maybe you can tell us. And if that's true, like, does that help assist with that problem? Just kind of anything that you can speak to on that.
I mean, I think we're still understanding the scope of what it is they're trying to accomplish and how they're going to do it for the public companies, much less like sort of the after effects. But I mean, I take your point, and I think that we will do our best to try to understand this and translate it for the industry once we understand exactly what's happening and what's expected. It makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, and I just want to note, I don't remember, I did listen to that panel, but I also had COVID at the same time, so I don't totally remember everything that happened. The law is on hold currently, or like the regs are on hold currently. So like both the SEC like opened for public comment, got way more comments than they expected to, and also had a technical problem with all of the comments. So maybe has lost the comments, unclear. But also there was a Supreme Court case in June that maybe limits their ability to do any of this, and nobody totally knows how they're going to interpret that. So the regs are not actually in place yet. It looks like something is going to happen, but we're not 100% certain what the something is. So that's also a factor too, is that we're kind of waiting to hear from them, like what they're actually going to do about it.
Understood. Thank you. I see a question coming in from Brandy. Brandy, do you want to pop on and ask it, or I can read it out?
Hold on. Hi guys.
Hi.
And I know I could ask you guys this otherwise, but I just thought about it because we did talk a lot about it at the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference. And that is basically that those who are asked to go to Washington for various meetings are generally, if not always, larger scale companies, individuals, traditional people who do business in a very traditional manner. And it's the folks on this call that are in our industry, but perhaps in a different space that never get called on. But it's super important that their voices are heard too. And so I guess I'm just wondering if there is an opportunity for organizations or groups or people like Christina or others on this call to get invited to some of those things so that their voices are heard too.
Yeah, totally. Part of what JVC does is advocate for the smaller business. So a lot of the reason that we're in the room and that we take very personally, like our obligation to make sure that smaller businesses are represented and understood in some of these meetings. But I also take your point that like, I think we could do a better job of indicating to our government partners, like, hey, when you're having these kinds of roundtables or things like that, you need to include the smaller people. And that's one thing that I expect from the FTC guide, the Green Guides revision. Like when they had the jewelry guides, they had a couple of roundtables and about precious metals specifically. And we made sure at the time that we were doing this, which was now like, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, that there were some smaller metalsmiths that were included on those panels. So some expert metalsmiths who were talking about some very, very technical things were included in those things. So if we do get invited to participate in any of the roundtables with the Green Guides, we will definitely make sure that they are representing a wide swath of the industry, including the smaller players, not just the big people.
Cool. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm not putting this on you guys, to be honest. I know that you fight for everybody, especially this group. So
we don't tend to bring anybody with us. We should. We tend to just try to communicate on our own and not have any commercial actors with us usually. But I'm sure now that we're kind of getting more back to being in real life with things, that there'll be more opportunities, more like hearings and roundtables. Usually what we're doing is one-on-one. We keep these relationships going with about 20 different regulators all the time. So we're constantly checking in and just like doing that. But yeah, JA does like traditional like lobbying that's like on the Hill type thing. That's like maybe a little bit more, I don't know the right word, but which could be good to be a part of if you're a member of JA. But I think that's a really helpful comment that maybe we can start to bring more people with us into these meetings, especially now that we're back in real life.
Thanks, guys.
We're at the end of our time today, and there are always more things that we could cover that we didn't get to. If there was something, earlier we dropped the link to the form in to submit questions or topics, ideas for living room sessions. We could drop that in again. It's something that you can always go to and share ideas with us. We really want the living room sessions to be of use to you. If that means revisiting legal parameters of our businesses, we can circle back around to that again. So please use that form. Otherwise, we make it up for you, and maybe you'll like it and maybe you won't. So also, huge thank you to Tiffany and Sara, not only for your preparation for this session today, but you show up all the time. Like, you're there, you're present, you're active, you're generous, you have accurate, researched information. You challenge us where we need to be challenged in positive and constructive ways. And so just really, like, we're super appreciative of your time today. What a knockout living room for 2022. Woo! So this is year 2 of living room sessions for us. So it's very exciting to be consistently delivering. And we really, really appreciate you being part of this last one. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you everyone for
Thank
being
you all
with
so
us.
much. We'll see you next year.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
Good job.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.